Joining us today on our panel are Trenton Marlar and Stephen Claremont of Embold Research. Embold Research is the nonpartisan unit of change research. They help leaders make informed decisions, build trust, and get things done by surveying everyday people online. Their innovative methodology, dynamic online sampling, reaches people where they're at their devices, and delivers accurate results to our clients at an affordable price. And Trenton Marlar brings over 6 years of survey research experience to Embold Research. He holds a PhD in political science from the University of Colorado Boulder, where he studied political behavior and political psychology. As a trained political scientist, Trenton's strengths include survey questionnaire design and statistical analysis. At Embold Research, he has established himself as a leader in understanding perspectives on renewable energy, serving a wide range of clients, including renewable energy developers and advocacy organizations working throughout the Southwest and mountain regions. Trenton lives in Colorado with his wife and 3 dogs. And Stephen Claremont, polling director, has worked in public opinion research and campaigns since 1993. He managed all of the state polling for the Gore 2000 campaign and has worked on thousands of polls for candidates at all levels of government. In New Mexico, he has worked with the House and Senate caucuses since 2004, including retaking the House in 2016 and building the durable majorities in both chambers since then. Since 2013, he has conducted statewide landscape polls in New Mexico for groups to build legislative campaigns. He holds a master's in applied statistics from George Mason University and a bachelor's in political science and economics from UC Berkeley. Stephen resides in the Virginia suburbs of Washington, D.C. And then we have our illustrious sponsors of the Local Solar Access Fund, House Majority Whip Rena Sapansky and Senator Harold Pope. Rena Sapansky represents New Mexico's 47th district, stretching from Santa Fe's east side to Glorieta and Canyoncito. She serves as the majority whip in the House, the first Asian American elected to leadership in the New Mexico legislature. Representative Sapansky has spent her career working for justice, equality, and public health, including through her leadership at the Drug Policy Alliance, the New Mexico Department of Health's hepatitis program, Emerge, and the New Mexico legislature. And Senator Harold Pope in 2020 made history by becoming the first African American ever elected to the New Mexico Senate. Prior to serving in the legislature, he served as an enlisted member of the Air Force and later received his commission and served as an acquisitions officer, program manager, chemist, and security cooperation officer. In 2018, he retired honorably after more than 20 years of devoted service. Since his election, he has been a driving force for positive change, serving as vice chair of the Senate Education Committee, a member of the Senate Conservation Committee, and co-chair of the Interim Military Veterans Affairs Committee. As a legislator, Harold has already achieved many accomplishments, including passing numerous bills pertaining to veterans, military families, civil rights, police reform, education, and environmental issues. He was elected by his colleagues to a leadership position in 2022, further solidifying his influence as Majority Caucus Chair. And then we also have Lisa LaRocque, who has been the sustainability officer for the city of Las Cruces since August 2013. During her tenure, Lisa has focused on renewable energy, climate change, and urban heat island impacts, and is now launching a large-scale workforce training and resiliency retrofit program for lower-income communities. Lisa also supports city staff in a myriad of sustainability projects, from energy finance models to arroyo protection. And I am Alysha Shaw. I am the campaign director with Public Power New Mexico. We're working to advance equitable energy transition, renewable development, and community-owned renewable power and energy democracy. And I'll be moderating this evening. And so we're going to start with a presentation from Trenton and Stephen, and then we'll hear from Representative Sapansky and Senator Pope about the Local Solar Access Fund, and I'll talk a little bit about it too. And then Lisa will share insights from her work and the potential impact that this fund can have. So without further ado, thank you all for joining us, and thank you to our great panelists. Let's hear some exciting poll results from Embold Research.
thank you again, Alysha, for the introduction. Just a reminder, my name is Trenton Marlar, and I'm an analyst with Embold Research. And I'm excited to be here to present you the results of a recent statewide survey of New Mexico voters, where we examined support for renewable energy and expanding access to solar energy in the state. To tell you briefly some of the methodological details of the survey, we surveyed just over 1,000 registered voters across the state using our proprietary methodology, dynamic online sampling. Respondents took the survey online using their own device. And as you consider the results, something that is important to keep in mind is that there's a margin of error of 3.2% in both directions. Give you a little overview of the sample. We were able to capture a sample that is representative of voters in New Mexico. Our sample reflects the racial and ethnic diversity of the state's voters, and we were also able to reach voters of all age groups. Consistent with the state's political makeup, the sample does lean slightly Democrat. And finally, we were able to survey voters throughout the state, ensuring that the results reflect voters living in all corners of New Mexico. And at the end of the slide deck, I do have a breakdown of which counties and legislative districts fall within each regions that we outline here. So if you have any questions about where certain counties fall in our regional breakouts, I'm happy to share that information with you as well. Before I dive into some of the results, I just want to highlight some additional details about our sample. Some of the questions we asked included their vote choice in the 2020 presidential election and the 2020 gubernatorial election, and we see that our sample closely resembles that of the actual vote results, which further validates that our sample is politically representative of New Mexican voters. Additionally, given the topics of renewable energy and solar energy, more specifically, we wanted to explore voters' personal connections to the oil and gas industry, the renewable energy industry, and local or state government. And we find that roughly 20% of voters have some personal connection with the oil and gas industry, whether that is themselves or one of their family members or friends working in the industry, while only around 1 in 10 people have a similar connection with the renewable energy industry. We see around a quarter of people have a personal connection with someone that works for local, tribal, or state government. To go into some of the key findings that you'll see presented in much more detail in future slides, we do see that over 70% of voters support solar and wind as energy sources in New Mexico. And in fact, we see 3/4 of voters want to see the state produce as much solar and wind energy as possible. Getting narrower and focusing specifically on expanding solar energy in the state, we see that there's significant interest in community solar. Nearly half of voters who don't already have rooftop solar will consider joining a community solar program if one was available to them, though we do see there's a notable chunk of individuals who are not sure yet. And finally, we see that the majority of voters support the creation of a state solar fund to help local governments plan and build public solar projects and further expand solar energy in the state. Well, I want to start by diving further into the survey results, beginning with general support for renewable energy in New Mexico. And what we see when we examine different electricity sources used in the state, that support for renewables, both solar and wind, far outweighs the opposition. Rooftop solar in particular is widely supported. We see that over 84% of voters support rooftop solar, including a majority of individuals who are strongly supportive. And then we see nearly 75% of voters expressing support for utility scale solar and wind wind as energy sources in the state, with only around 20% of voters opposed. So again, support far outweighs opposition, and we do see a decent level of strong support as well. When it does come to the fossil fuel sources, we do see strong support for natural gas, while voters are relatively split in their support for coal as an energy source, with Republicans tend to be more favorable of coal than Democrats and independents. To look at this more specifically by partisanship, while there is this widespread support, I think one of the really important findings of this research is that there's strong support for renewable energy sources across partisanship. Perhaps unsurprisingly, Democrats are strong proponents of renewable energy sources and are particularly opposed to coal, but we see minimal drop-off in support for rooftop solar among independents and Republican voters, and importantly, a majority of independents and Republicans support wind and utility-scale solar. We do see Republicans in particular expressing more support for fossil fuels, But overall, we see strong support across the partisan spectrum for renewable energy sources in the state. And that this support for renewable energies extends to the different regions of the state. Not only do most New Mexicans support renewables, but we also see that most of them believe that the state should produce as much electricity from renewable sources as possible. Again, we do see some partisan differences, but a majority of voters, both Republicans and Democrats, want to see the state maximize its renewable energy production, though Democrats are much more likely to want to see more renewable energy. And similarly, we don't see significant regional variation apart from the Southeast, which is likely driven by partisan differences as well. While voters do want to see the state maximize its renewable energy production, roughly 1/3 of voters think that their electricity provider has slowed the energy transition. And when asked how this has been done, top cited reasons are by prioritizing fossil fuels and blocking legislation or creating legal barriers that would allow renewable energy projects to develop. Now I'm going to narrow in on our findings, detailing support for expanding solar energy in the state, focusing specifically on rooftop and community solar in this section. But first, we wanted to gauge individuals' personal experience with solar. And what we see is that around 1 in 5 voters report that they have installed solar panels at their home, with those living in central New Mexico the most likely to personally have solar. But we also see that nearly half of voters have seen solar energy installations in their community, and a similar number of voters know someone who has solar. So there's a lot of familiarity, specifically with rooftop solar among New Mexico voters. Overall, it's Native Americans and those who live in the northern part of the state who are less likely to have personal experience with solar than other individuals living in the state. As we saw a few slides ago, there is widespread support for rooftop solar, and this is driven by voters seeing a variety of benefits that come with rooftop solar. Across partisanship, a large majority of voters see rooftop solar as a way to save money on their electricity bill. For Democrats specifically, we see that rooftop solar is perceived as a clean and sustainable energy source and is helping combat climate change. When we look at the Republican voters, in addition to the benefit of cost savings, we see that 1/3 of Republicans and nearly half of independents see energy independence as a benefit of rooftop solar. And overall, relatively few voters don't see any benefits to rooftop solar, which is consistent with our finding that there's pretty widespread support for rooftop. Shifting to community solar, after we told voters a little bit about community solar, we see that a plurality of voters, 41%, would be interested in joining a community solar program if it was available to them. And there's around 8% who said that they already have rooftop solar, so they would not necessarily be interested in joining. Whereas around 1/4, 23%, say that they would not be interested in signing up. But a critical finding here is that there's a lot of space for education to get more voters interested in the program. We see around 30% of voters report that they are not sure whether they join. So this is an opportunity to, with learning more about community solar and its benefits, we could certainly see interest increase. We see Democrats are far more interested in joining community solar programs than Republicans and independents. And compared to Anglo and Hispanic voters, Native Americans are much more likely to be interested in joining as well. When it comes to the perceived benefits of community solar, similar to rooftop solar, we see that cost savings is something that expands across the partisan lens. This is the top benefit for all groups. But in addition to cost savings, we see that Democrats see other benefits such as greater use of clean energy, as well as making renewable energy more accessible to members of the community that may not otherwise have access to solar, such as those who are renters, low-income households, or those whose homes are not suitable for rooftop. And then finally, we wanted to explore the perceived impact of recently passed federal legislation on local communities, as well as gauge support for the creation of a state solar fund. So looking at whether voters believe their community will benefit from the funding for solar and battery storage in the IRA and bipartisan infrastructure laws, we see that partisanship is playing a significant role here, with Democrats much more likely to believe that their community will benefit from this federal legislation, than both independents and Republicans. In fact, we see a majority of Republicans believe that their community will not benefit at all from the recent legislation. Overall, though, around 1 in 5 voters are not sure whether their community will benefit from the recent federal legislation. In order to help localities take advantage of the substantial funding that the IRA and bipartisan infrastructure law has provided, there is a proposal to create a state solar fund to help localities with the planning and building of public solar projects using excess oil and gas revenue. And after telling voters a bit about this proposal, we see that a majority, nearly 3 in 5 voters, support the creation of a state solar fund. In fact, nearly 1/3 of voters strongly support its creation, and around 10% aren't sure. As we've seen in the other slides, support for the state solar fund's creation is strongest among Democrats, with independents also more likely to be supportive than opposed. However, we do see that a majority of Republicans are opposed to the creation of a state solar fund. Across nearly all the regions, we see a majority of voters support the creation of the state solar fund, outside of those in the Southeast. And this opposition is likely driven by the partisan makeup of that region of the state. So overall, we do see significant interest in expanding the capabilities of localities to create more solar facilities in their communities. And so I want to leave you with some of the three main takeaways from this research. There is widespread support for the use of renewable energy sources in the state. Nearly half of voters would join a community solar program if one was available to them. And voters see community solar as a way to save money on their electricity bills and make renewable energy more accessible. And importantly, as I mentioned, many voters are unsure, 28% in fact, that there's are unsure about community solar. So there's an opportunity to increase interest with more education on community solar programs and their benefits. And then finally, most voters do want to see the state maximize its renewable energy production. As such, we see nearly 60% support the creation of a state solar fund to help local governments build public solar projects. And I'll just flip quickly to the slide showing the breakdown of the regions, but that is everything I have. And I'm happy to answer any questions when the time comes. And I appreciate you all being with us tonight to learn more about these findings.
Thank you so much. And I don't think I mentioned this, but we will do Q&A after these presentations. So if you have a question, please use the Q&A function in the Zoom webinar, and we will get to them after the presentations. Next, we will turn to Representative Rena Sapansky and Senator Harold Pope to talk about the Local Solar Access Fund.
Thank you so much, Alysha, and thanks for that great briefing. I am really, really excited to be working on this initiative. I think particularly right now, there's a groundswell in our state to get things done. We have huge opportunities with federal infrastructure funding, and the real challenge of the session is how do we build and invest in things today, in projects and in infrastructure today that are going to benefit us for generations. And this bill, it's not only another sprint forward to increase our solar portfolio, but it's also hyper-focused and tailor-made to distribute solar across the state. So you're going to see in the legislation that we are prioritizing rural communities to receive the majority of the funding. We are prioritizing communities that don't necessarily have the capital from their own revenue base, or they may not necessarily have the capacity to pursue federal grants. And as was reflected in the polling, we have heard from communities of every size around our state. And in particular, this is about local solar and moving that energy transition forward more quickly, but it's also about disaster resiliency. So one of the reasons that energy storage was included in the bill is because we know that we need disaster resiliency projects in every community in our state. However, not every small community has the capital and the capacity. So this fund is going to change that. It's going to empower our local communities to lead in creating a solar future for our state. I think you will see that this fund is going to be a big missing link. We have some sources of federal funding, but a lot of times local communities cannot come up with the matching funds or the initial funding that they need to truly access those federal funds. So there's going to be a lot of efficiency that comes with the investment of our state dollars in this as well. And I have a vision that, you know, this fund is going to lead to the very first, maybe second or third solar projects in some of those communities around the state. What we saw over the past year with, or past couple of years with fires, flooding, there's really a sense of vulnerability in some of our systems. And with this fund, we're going to be able to provide funding so that every community in New Mexico has the capacity to build a resilient center for their community. So whether that be heating or cooling, depending on what the situation is, whether that be an emergency shelter, having something that is resilient in the event that the grid goes down is really important. And is an important part of addressing climate change in the years to come. So I'm really excited about how this fund is going to complement other initiatives moving forward this session in terms of workforce development. There's going to be a big apprenticeship bill that we're very excited about, and looking at those opportunities to build the workforce, create jobs across the state, and then also keep moving solar forward. I'm very excited and honored to be part of this bill, and I'm going to turn it over to my esteemed colleague, Senator Harold Pope.
Thank you, Whipsy Fancy. You did an awesome job. I don't know if there's any much more that I can say, but that's why you're in leadership, and I'm glad to have you on board. The reality is, I think that people in our state and communities have been asking for this. Right now, we have the resources to do this, and this is when we really start investing in our future. We really start investing in us. And as a state, we have such a huge resource when we talk about the sun. And we have communities, though, that do not have access to the expertise or the resources to start these projects and have these projects in their communities. And I think this fund is just going to be a great asset to make that happen. You know, here in Albuquerque and some of the, the bigger communities, we can do that. But some of our communities and some of our tribal communities just do not have access to the funds to do this. This is going to be a huge opportunity for these communities to have really some safety and security and resiliency when it comes to their power. And it's going to be a job creator. This is economic development as well, as was mentioned. I know there's going to be maybe talk and confusion about some of the other programs that are already in the state. This will be a complement. This will also be able to complement what's going on at the federal level with the Inflation Reduction Act. And so this will be able to use, they'll be able to use it to leverage a lot of the funding and a lot of the resources to get things done. Finally, I'll just end that once again, this is what people have been asking for. We are in a climate crisis. And here in New Mexico, we're at the center of it with what we deal with here, but also with what's happening here with oil and gas. We're at the center of it. So it's important that we make that transition for the sake of our public health, for the sake of our environment, and for the sake of our future. And I think this is one of the tools that's going to get us there. So thank you. I'll pass it back over to you, Alysha.
Thank you so much. I think you spoke very beautifully about the bill and what's so exciting for all of us about it. I am going to share my screen and just do a short presentation on what the bill is and what it does, and what led to this as well. So the local solar access fund. It is a proposed grant fund at the New Mexico Finance Authority which will issue both planning and implementation grants to tribes, counties, municipalities, and school districts for solar and storage projects that power public buildings like libraries, schools, community centers, and fire stations, and critical infrastructure like water and wastewater, and also street lighting. Planning, and when we're talking about planning and implementation, planning includes funding technical expertise like grant writers and federal funding experts, as well as solar experts who conduct feasibility studies and create plans for solar and storage systems. And implementation includes funding construction, purchase, installation, and equipment of solar and energy storage systems. And the fund will be established in law with a one-time, non-recurring, non-reverting appropriation of $110 million. What are some of the benefits of solar? Why is solar so popular, as we've just learned? Cost savings and increased revenue is a big thing. So local communities can save money and reduce their energy bills and then devote that money to other community needs. Solar is cheaper than conventional energy and rates are fixed over 25 to 30 years. Solar protects communities from market volatility and price gouging. Solar is also really resilient and it enhances our safety and security. Communities could turn a big community center into an emergency cooling center that maintains power when there are blackouts, brownouts, storms, and wildfires. And of course, solar reduces carbon emissions to support community health and help address climate change. It is also a much less water-intensive energy source than others. So we know that that's an important part of this too in a state like ours. And so this is some of the outreach we did to get to this policy. We conducted a focus group last summer over the course of 3 months that brought together people from local governments, tribal governments, NGOs, and other community members to explore different policy options to increase access to community-owned solar and to solarize public buildings. And this is the policy that came out of that focus group. We also called all the local tribal governments in the state, county and municipal, as well as school districts, and are still doing that outreach, learning about what exists on the ground and what do communities need. Can they access federal funding? Would this fund help? And we also did lots of meetings with a number of these folks, as well as other stakeholders, folks from the renewable energy industry, and then the statewide survey that Embold presented at the beginning of this webinar. And these are just a few of some of the highlights from some of the outreach. We did call all of these entities, but this was our contact rate in terms of being able to connect with folks who could answer all of our questions. And of the tribes we talked to, we found that about half had solar and about 3/4 were interested in developing solar or had plans to do so. With the counties, 36% of the ones we talked to had solar and 73% had plans and interest in solar. Municipalities did not have as much existing solar. They had about 1/4, and 31% confirmed that they had plans in developing solar and interest in developing solar. But many of them said that if a fund like this existed, they would be more likely to pursue these projects and interested in that. And then from the school districts we talked to, we found that 15% had solar and 96% were planning and interested in developing solar. And again, that research and outreach is ongoing. And some of our big takeaways from this are that most rural municipalities in New Mexico currently lack funding to plan and implement solar, but would develop solar to power public buildings and infrastructure if accessible funding were available. A lot of what we've heard in these conversations is that federal funding timelines, the kinds of administration that's required, and reporting and it's very labor intensive to a point where sometimes the grants aren't even worth applying for, or they're very competitive. So a lot of our communities aren't applying for federal funding because they don't have the support that they need to get that funding. We've also learned that New Mexico communities have important public safety and resilience needs, such as power and shelter for residents and first responders during emergencies and disasters, and this fund could support them developing those. And then we also got data on different arrays that existed. And from some of what we were looking at, we found that local governments can save up to $10 million after 25 years by investing in a megawatt of solar. Now that varies. Solar arrays vary in price and size and generation, but the cost savings are great and they last for years, as well as the resiliency. And then solar is more affordable and accessible than ever. The general trend is that costs are falling. Between 2009 and 2019, solar costs fell more than 90%, and these trends are likely to continue. And this is some case studies to give you an example of how the fund could work. So for instance, a county manager wants to make sure that the community center can operate in case of emergencies or outages by installing solar or storage. With passage of the bill, they could apply to NMFA to fund a feasibility study, a grant writer, and an IRA funding expert, and then apply for federal grants and green bank financing to fund 70% of the project. They could then receive a 30% cash subsidy from the IRA after completion. And this example gives you a sense of what we're trying to do with this legislation. We really want this to be a piece of the funding puzzle that helps maximize investment into our communities, especially for communities that haven't been able to get this kind of funding and investment. And it's very complementary to other sources of funding too. That's the intention of that. A city council, this is another example, is reviewing the budget and finds itself short $100,000 for critical elder care programs. Utility bills have been growing substantially each year for facilities and eating into every department budget. Someone suggests adding solar panels to reduce these costs. Where would they start? The planning or funding with no room in the budget to hire that kind of expertise. The local solar access fund would help them hire experts to plan and fund solar projects that will save energy dollars and power critical facilities. And so the fund is structured to prioritize funding projects that benefit rural communities, serve communities that wouldn't be able to access solar and storage without this funding, make essential community buildings and infrastructure resilient, and have significant long-term operating cost reductions, projects that support workforce development, and are geographically diverse and dispersed. Why do we want to do this now? There's urgency here. And one big reason, there's a few big reasons. One is that we have unprecedented but temporary budget surpluses from oil and gas revenue. And there are times, another big one is that there are time-sensitive federal funding opportunities on the table that we are at risk of missing out on if our communities can't access grant writers and technical expertise. We've already missed a lot of opportunities and they're not going to last forever. So it's really important that we have this capacity building mechanism that can help leverage more of that money. And then communities throughout our state want to build solar projects that will save money and make them safer and more resilient, especially in emergencies, and reduce dangerous climate emissions. However, most of our local governments and tribal governments don't have the capital to build these projects or the staff to access federal grants. This fund will help communities overcome these obstacles to build the solar they need and invest in their future for decades to come. And there's lots more to say, but I'll stop there. And now I would like to turn it over to Lisa LaRocque, Sustainability Officer for the City of Las Cruces, to talk a little bit about the kind of impact this fund could have.
Thanks, Alysha. Hi, again, I'm Lisa LaRocque, and I am the Sustainability Officer, and I am responsible for addressing climate change, especially when it comes to transitioning to clean energy. And I've been doing that for the last 10 years. And the city is keenly supports the local solar access fund, not only for Las Cruces, but to assure that solar is available throughout the state. First, I'll start with what it will mean to Las Cruces. And so what's on my wish list as a sustainability officer for the city? What would I like to do? To make the most of this opportunity, this is how I could use $500,000 for the from the local solar access fund. I could install solar at our municipal water well and avoid paying electric bills of $65,000, which covers the usual annual cost to pump water for our city at that well. Or I could add battery storage to an established solar installation at a large senior center, which also serves as a cooling center, protecting residents from extreme weather events and other adversities. Or we could stretch the range of our 5 new electric buses by adding a storage battery that feeds induction charging as the bus is idle. Those are all things on my wish list for real. And Las Cruces has had the luxury of having staff to seek funds and implement solar projects. But I can say that I know firsthand that that's a lot of work. And the local solar access funds will remove a lot of the obstacles for the smaller communities. The example of having help to find expertise and pay for the expertise to step communities through the process is a wonderful opportunity that would allow us to be able, allow small communities to be able to do a lot of things. But I would also like to say that cities like Las Cruces and me, for example, would be happy to share what we've learned in selecting buildings, contracting installers, or even tapping into the internal revenues services direct payments to nonprofits like municipalities in lieu of tax credits. They can be equal to about 50% of the total cost, so we can really leverage the funds that come from this local solar access funding that the state is trying to get passed. So there's so many opportunities, and I really hope that this is one that gets through the legislative session, and I will stand ready to get my wishes come true. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lisa. And so everyone, that concludes our presentation. So it's time for questions and answers. And it looks like we have a few. So please use the Q&A function to ask any questions you may have. The first question is from Neil Turnquist, and it's, how does the bill define rural communities? I can take that if no one else wants to. So there's a rulemaking section in the bill where NMFA will define criteria and advocate for prioritizing applications in its application process. And that includes that NMFA will define rural in their rulemaking. And then Bill Bright asked if there is a plan to include tribal Navajo access to this fund. And I can also answer that. The fund will definitely be able to fund tribal solar and storage projects that power public buildings and infrastructure owned by a tribal government, including the Navajo Nation, as long as it's within the state. Okay, this is a 2-part question from Melissa Troutman. And actually, is there anything you want to add, Representative Sapansky or Senator Pope, to any of those questions before I move on?
No, thank you.
No,
Alysha,
I think you answered them, and I think it's important that was what we wanted to do in this bill, right? Was be inclusive and make sure that we especially included our tribal communities. So, but you answered it correctly. So
great. And then this one I think would be great for you to answer. So here's a 2-part question. Sounds like the hardest sell is in the Permian Basin region. Is there a strategy to increase awareness and support for solar in rural communities there? I facilitate the Permian Basin Climate Justice Solution and would love to help. And then 2, this is off topic, but are any presenters aware of programs focused on transitioning oil and gas workers to employment in the solar industry? And I believe you mentioned something to that end, Representative Sapansky, for that second question.
Yeah, I can talk a little bit about the second question. There was a couple of years ago a just transition kind of task force that was created that has been meeting sporadically over the last couple of years to talk about this question of how do we create an economic transition for folks that are currently employed in the oil and gas industry. Although Melissa, given your position, you're probably very aware of that committee. I haven't heard of anything specifically that is transitioning folks from oil and gas to solar. But I will say there are a number of programs that, particularly starting with the Energy Transition Act, that have been going to work in the Northwest around transitioning folks from natural gas and the gas plant there to other forms of employment. This year there will be a very large investment that it will be considered by the legislature into apprenticeships and actually creating an apprenticeship trust fund. Senator Pope, I think you're involved with that, so I won't say too much, but my colleague, Representative Joy Garrett, is also been a champion for that. And I think that would be an amazing pathway to train more folks to work in the solar industry. So I'll stop there because I think Senator Pope also knows quite a bit about this topic.
I think you covered it well, and I think the key is trying to get some of our tradesmen and get some of our labor folks out in other parts of the state. It's easier to kind of have this training and the expertise here around Albuquerque and Santa Fe, and maybe even a little bit even in Las Cruces. But how do we get it in southeast New Mexico? But I think that's where we're going to need to make investments and help folks with that transition. Because once again, what I struggle with is we're trying to make the transition, but it's tough to tell a person, hey, your job's going away, but we don't have an option for you to make a living, right? And so we have to get to work and make sure that we're doing an equitable and just transition. Going to the first question, it is a hard sell, but I look at it this way. We're talking about the unprecedented money that we're getting in revenue right now, but it's not going to last forever. Probably the next 8 to 10 years. So regardless of what we do, whether we transition or not, this money, the oil, it's going to go away. The world is even transitioning. So we have to transition no matter what. So whether it be someone who is concerned about our climate and understands that we need to make the transition, great. I'll always make that argument. But we can also make the argument about the fact that this is going to save money in these communities. So even in the Southeast, where it's an oil and gas community, they still pay electric bills. They still need electrical power to run their public buildings, to run their pump stations, to run their facilities. And right now, it is more economical to go solar than it is to get electrical power by other means. So I think that's really where the sell is. And that's just what we just have to continue to talk about. And I think a bill like this helps make that argument and brings resources in those communities to where they can make the right decision, whether it be climate, economic, both. But I think it's just the best choice I would argue, for any community to go this route.
Thank you. Does anyone want to add anything, Lisa? Or I think we covered it. Okay. An anonymous attendee says, maybe I missed it, but is this being talked about this upcoming session? Yes, it is. And then also asked, do these funds have any obligation to use local contractors for labor implementation if moving forward with projects? I can answer that. So projects that have a local workforce development component are prioritized, and prices need to stay below the state price agreement. As written, it does not require the use of local workers, which we heard is particularly local companies, because we heard that was prohibitive for some tribal nations that actually would want to use their own like indigenous owned companies, which might be out of state. But to the extent we do want to incentivize local economic development and local workforce development and local, we really want this to catalyze the renewable energy industry in New Mexico and that development. Is there anything the sponsors would like to add about that? No, okay. Now we have a question from Hannah Grover with NM Political Report. I have two questions. If grid upgrades are needed to interconnect the solar to the distribution or transmission system, would the fund help pay for that? And what are you hearing from utilities in response to this bill? Does one of you want to take that, or should I?
I can answer the first question, which is the interconnection is a permissible use of the funding. And in terms of the utilities, I'm not sure that I have heard a response from them yet. But we're going to be introducing the bill very soon, and I think we'll hear from them quickly. But I don't know, Senator Pope or Alysha, if you have anything to add there.
Yeah, and I would say on the first part, I mean, there's always concerns about distribution and transmission, but in many cases, these will be set up to power the actual that public building or that facility in a lot of ways. So there still may be distribution, but for the most part, that facility where the rooftop or that structure that's using it is that solar is going to be the main user of the power. So I know there's always talk about can our grid take it? Are we going to need all these transmission lines to do this? I think there is going to be an impact, but I don't think it's going to be something that right now that the current grid is unable to support.
Lisa?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that under our regulations right now, we do, as Senator Pope said, that we do have to have net metering. We have to connect it to a building or an infrastructure. So we're replacing solar with what's there. So it shouldn't have a large grid impact on that, because it is just replacing the energy that's needed.
Thank you. And I can just piggyback on some of these responses. I also haven't heard much about what, the utilities are thinking of this bill yet, but generally all the feedback I've heard from so many different diverse organizations and coalitions and people from all around the state is extreme excitement and support. So I'm hearing a lot of enthusiasm, and I'm really excited to see this move forward. Nikhil asks, will copies of these slides be available? Interested in sharing information with our coalition members? Yes, we'll send a recording and the slide decks to everyone who signed up for the webinar. Noreen Baca asks, how can we help support this bill in the legislature? I'm going to drop a link in the chat if you do want to get involved. And I don't know if the representative or senator want to add anything about participating in the legislative process.
I would just say, starting off, you're here, right? And so you're helping us get the word out. So continue to do that. I know everyone's not on this Zoom. Everybody can't be at every meeting. Get the word out. And we're also trying to work to see what we can do with the governor, and to see if we can, get this, get a message and get this in the budget. So really, it's about community support. So getting the word out and reaching out to your representative and senator and seeing if they would support this. I think that would be a big help as well.
Yeah, 100%. And never doubt that your voice will make a difference, because I've seen it time and time again. For all of you that are taking the time to get involved tonight, I think it's a great start, and talking to your legislators is always helpful, especially in a bill that has such a big potential positive impact for New Mexico. I think it's really important. So thank you all for being here as the first step.
Thank you. Question from Kevin, and he says, when do you expect to introduce the legislation in the House and Senate? And can we get copies of the presentations? Yes, we will mail copies of the presentations, and Representative, do you want to speak to the introduction, or Senator?
Yeah, I think we're very close to having the very final version of the bill. So my hope is that it'll be pre-filed this week before Friday. But if not, it'll be filed on Tuesday.
Thank you. And Adrian Hedden asks, how do you respond to assertions from oil and gas industry supporters that solar and other renewable energy forms will not be able to replace fossil fuels completely while meeting energy demands? What can you say to cities in oil and gas regions that might be hesitant to invest in solar? Lisa, do you want to kick this one off? I feel like you probably have a lot to say on this.
Well, I do, but I think that what we have found in Las Cruces is we have 25% of our municipal energy comes from solar, and it is a big savings. And it would be remiss of I mean, whether you want to maintain gas and oil, that doesn't stop you from needing to use electricity. And so they don't have to compete. I would argue that it's a good thing to transition to clean energies if ever possible, because there are so many health impacts there, and the ideas of that the representative said about climate change and extreme weather events and what we need to do, well, both of the senator as well, we need to be addressing that. But having, if that isn't your thing, the advantages of solar are extraordinary. And the ability to have backup systems is really important. So those economics alone and safety alone are good enough reasons to.
Thank you. Anyone else want to chime in on that one?
I guess I would just say that, we're still making a transition. And I can also argue to say that we don't function right now with all of our power needs off oil and gas. We can't have this Zoom meeting right now just off oil. Now, you might argue and say, there's maybe if there was a oil or coal-fired power plant that's producing your electricity, right? You could do that. But right now, once again, it's more affordable to go solar or wind for electrical power. So I think that's what this is about. And I know there's always fears that what we do is going to shut down the industry. But we have to make that transition. The world's making that transition. Our communities are asking us to make that transition. Our planet needs us to make that transition. So, that's what we're going to have to do.
Thank you. Christopher asks, are there specific guidelines on who can perform a feasibility study and receive funds to do so? So the funding from this fund is going to go to 4 different kinds of entities. That's municipalities, counties, tribal governments, and school districts. In terms of their grant applications for planning or building a solar project, they'll be assessed by guidelines that are created during rulemaking in consultation, and NMFA is going to do that in consultation with the Energy, Minerals, and Natural Resources department. So there will be guidelines created in rule, but they're not all listed out in the legislation. Would you guys add anything to that, or does that cover that? Yeah. Here's a question from John. Will this fund provide support for writing grants for small communities? San Miguel and Mora counties are pursuing Justice 40 funding for projects that make this region more resilient for future climate disruptions. Someone want to take that one?
Yeah, I would say yes, planning and support for obtaining federal funds are included as purposes in the grant. I would also say that there are some other initiatives of the legislature to create more grant writing support. There have been a couple of efforts so far just to increase grant writing capacity around the state that have been funded. And I think you'll see this session an attempt to double down on that and expand it.
Lisa?
Yeah, there's also a network of, well, in sustainability that we share RFPs and grants templates. So you can, use those and adapt them as needed. So that's available for people to use as a template. I've even borrowed some and found that it was language I'd written years ago. So they do something.
And I'll just add, and that's why this legislation is so important. We have communities that cannot even access some of these federal funds that are out there because they don't have the grant writers, they don't have the expertise, and this fund will allow them to do that and take advantage of that. Because right now they're just missing out on opportunities that they don't even have a shot to try to get any of this funding right now. So.
Thank you. And I believe that is Senator Bill Tallman asks, what is the initial funding amount? And that is 110 million, non-recurring, non-reverting. He also asks, can I assume this is not for residential? That is correct. Although there might be an outlier in terms of like a community, like a municipally or county or tribally owned public housing potentially, but that would be fairly limited in scope. It's intended for public buildings and infrastructure. And he also asks, has this program been successfully implemented in other states? I think some of the inspiration, and I'll pass this on to others to see, if there are other thoughts on this, but is from Minnesota, which has a lot less sun than we do, and yet somehow has a lot of really revolutionary, amazing solar policy. And they passed like a massive investment. I believe it was 80-something million into different kinds of solar, similar to what we're doing. And that was both public and private. This is exclusively public. Do you want to add anything? Okay. Ian says, you're pushing to replace fossil fuels has two major problems. First, oil and gas provides over 1/3 of New Mexico government revenues. How are you going to replace that tax revenue? Second, fossil fuels is one of the largest employers in New Mexico. You say those employed in oil and gas will transition to solar and wind jobs. Obama said that coal miners in West Virginia and Pennsylvania would transition to solar jobs. Up to date, this date, solar replacement jobs have not been showing up. How will New Mexico fare better than any of those states? Any thoughts on that one?
We can talk about that. Yeah, appreciate that. I think one, our economic transition is more complicated than just a transition from oil and gas to solar and wind and other renewable energy sources, because as you point out, the jobs are not necessarily interchangeable. You're not going to necessarily have every single oil and gas worker moving into solar or a renewable energy industry. We have to have a variety of solutions. I can't stress this enough. While we address climate change and while we move to quickly reduce emissions and move to have all of the environmental protections for our future, we also have to have a lot of irons in the fire for economic development because of the two things you point out, which is our revenue. We have to figure out ways that we are going to continue to fund all of the essential services, public schools, healthcare, you name it. There's a lot of programs in this state, behavioral health treatment, that depend on our state revenues. One of the ways to do that is looking at economic diversification. So for example, last last session, I sponsored a bill and I'm continuing to fight for the creative industries division, because that is something that is present in all of our communities. But how do we turn the creative industries into a full-time job that actually pays the bills and includes benefits and allows people to have a good living for their families? And I think with some state investment, we can really leverage that. And that's just one example. There's also a lot of other industries. So I think I just want everyone to know that we have to see this as a multifaceted problem and a multifaceted solution and be able to navigate that. And that it's not simply we're switching out industries, because they're not the same in a lot of ways. And so we have to figure out other ways to diversify the economy.
And I think the representative hit the main point. These are different industries. When we're talking oil and gas, we're talking a global market. That's not what's going to really happen with the solar and, you know, the wind energy and stuff that we're doing in our state. And so we really have to diversify. There are other states that don't have oil and gas revenue at all, and they are diversified enough to pay for healthcare, education, and all the other services. And we have to diversify. You know, before I came in the legislature, my first year in 21, before that, during COVID, right, folks had to come up to the roundhouse and, you know, make some budget cuts. And we were still relying on oil and gas. So regardless, if we were to do nothing, we are still at the whim of the global oil market. And even we looked at a few years ago, this revenue was not coming in. So regardless of what happens, we have to diversify. It's just right now we're at a point where a lot of revenue is coming in, but at what cost in the long term? And to me, this is where we make the right investments to where we save money in the future. And we're using some of this oil and gas money to diversify our economy and to make up for that. But it's not going to be one industry. There's not one industry that's going to be one for one that's going to make up the money. It's just not.
Lisa, did you want to add anything to that? No. Okay. Here's one question that I accidentally marked as answered from an anonymous attendee. Do we expect unions like the IBEW and the state to be supportive? Are there arguments we can use to persuade union members in various craft jobs that this will be beneficial to them? I can kick this off by saying that we do have language in the bill that prioritizes projects that have workforce development, including hiring locally and using apprenticeship programs and paying the prevailing wage, which is very important to workers and unions. I think we will have support. I think this is about a jobs bill. This is an economic development bill. This is about investing in our community's resilience and safety and security and future. And I think that there's a lot to like about it. Other thoughts on that one?
I agree. And we have been in communication with some of the folks in that head up some of our labor organizations. And I think once the bill is finalized, I think we will see some support. I'm not going to speak for them, but very positive conversation so far.
Great. And the next question is from Jacob. How will the grant application process for this funding work? What should entities that want to apply for funding know? Does anyone want to take this, or I can start it off? So currently
You're doing such a great job, Alysha. We'll let you start off.
I hate talking too much. You guys have such insightful things to say. So the way it's structured is that a municipality, a county, a tribe, or a school district could apply for a grant at NMFA for either planning a solar project, and that would include grant writing, getting some federal funding experts, getting some technical expertise from solar professionals to look at where a feasible site would be, do cost estimates, kind of design it and capacitate them to move forward and get additional funding. Or it could be used for a shovel-ready project that maybe doesn't have enough funding lately. Maybe a community has already done the planning, has already worked on a feasibility study, but they just need some extra cash to hit the ground quickly to build, a solar project that powers a public building or a water treatment plant or something like that. That the specific details of the application process and the sort of metrics and priorities are going to be hammered out in rule by the New Mexico Finance Authority, which is an extraordinary agency that does really, really great, impactful work throughout our state. They are so skilled at creating accessible funding and financing sources for our communities. So they're very skilled at doing that kind of rulemaking to iron out those details. Any other thoughts on that or anything I might have missed? And then John asks, please post a link to the survey information by county. I'm assuming you're talking about the Embold research that was presented earlier today. We are going to release those results publicly tomorrow. And we do have some regional data that's really good. I don't know if there's anything you all want to say, Steve or Trenton, about just any of the geographic things that you noticed in the top line, if anyone missed them that came late.
I think the big takeaway is that in terms of these questions about solar, just how geographically broad the support is for rooftop solar in particular, that there aren't a lot of regional differences. The support is strong everywhere. If you want to add anything, Trenton.
The only thing I would add is just to ensure that we're giving you results that are statistically valid. We're unable to break out individually by every single county, which is why we did those groupings that you can see in the results that Alysha said will be released tomorrow. And I included the information of which counties fall in which region. But we want to make sure we're giving information that is, large enough sample sizes to actually have meaningful results from it.
Thank you. Sharon asks, will you anticipate opposition to the bill? I'll say that I personally don't think there's going to be a lot based on what I've seen. I've really been talking to so many different people from around the state, and I think that this is generating a lot of enthusiasm from a lot of different people in a lot of different sectors and a lot of different communities. So I feel really excited that there's something good and impactful that we can work on and agree on that's going to make our state better. Is there anything else you would add? And then Emma says, do you all see this as an opportunity to build bipartisan support around this policy? And if so, can you share more about that? Any thoughts?
I do see some possibilities because we do have city and county and tribal governments that have expressed real interest in adding solar and battery storage to their facilities. And depending on the location of those cities, some of them are represented by folks from across the aisle on the other side of the aisle. So I think there's always potential. I'm always an optimist. We will see. And I agree with you. I think there will be a lot of support for the bill overall. I think the real challenge that we face is getting an appropriation of this size as we're going into what is going to be a very a budget year where there are a lot of different projects that are looking for investment, and a lot of different areas of government and of the state that are looking for investment. So I think that's going to be the big challenges, is helping this initiative rise to that priority level.
And I agree. I just think, to me, this is a nonpartisan issue. When you look at our communities, some of our smaller communities, whether you're in a, you're a member of the Democratic Party, Republican Party, Independent, your public buildings and facilities need this power. And so this is giving an opportunity, and especially in some of our rural areas, our tribal communities that may not have the resources to start the planning and to benefit from some of the federal funding. So I just think there's some opportunities. I know, there's talk of other things in oil and gas, but this is also a separate issue, in the sense that we're talking about powering public buildings. So I want to emphasize that as well. It's not a threat to the industry, but it is something that's going to help our environment, our climate, and save our ratepayers at the end of the day. So I think this is something that everybody can get on board with.
Yes,
I'd like to add that the municipality, Las Cruces, only uses 5% of the energy of the whole citywide. And when we move to clean energy, we are not paying an electric bill, and that allows us to use our funds for other things that have greater priority to the city. And it's in terms of the utilities, it's not really making a big difference, because that, it's even a smaller amount. And we talk about the 25% that we do. I wish that we were making even a bigger impact, but I just to echo on Senator Pope's comments, there's a lot of other fish in the sea that are using different types of things, but it helps us use the money for other priorities.
thank you. And I would just add, I do think that there's a huge opportunity to build bipartisan support. And I think one of the most incredible things is really seeing the survey that Embold Research did. And I'm wondering if either of you, Stephen or Trenton, could just speak to the bipartisanship of New Mexicans' interests in solar and renewables for anyone who might have missed that.
In the survey, particularly support for rooftop solar is largely bipartisan. I think in majority support in large solar fields. I found in surveying over the years on this question that on renewable energy is that voters in New Mexico are sort of very understood for many years the benefits of renewable energy, both in Albuquerque, Las Cruces, as well as rural New Mexico, and it's always part of a larger mix of different energy sources. But there's never really been much opposition. And I think that over the years, people's concerns about renewable energy have been centered on costs. But as Senator Pope has said, as the technology has improved, the costs have gone down. And is one of the key things to talk about with voters of all parties, is not only is renewable energy sustainable, it will ultimately be more affordable in the long run.
Yeah, and if I can just add, and I'll just share, I have the slide up again, just showing that I should be sharing that slide again, that we do have bipartisan support for these renewable sources already. Rooftop solar, it's large majority, over 3/4 of even Republicans. And then when we look at wind and utility scale solar, we're seeing majority of people support. And overall, the opposition to these things is, far outweighed by support. So I think you see in New Mexico that there's very strong support, and across different communities that I've pulled in on these topics, we certainly see the highest support for renewables, specifically solar in New Mexico and other states in the Southwest. I think these communities and states are the communities that have the most experience with solar and can recognize the benefits that come with it. And just echoing again some of the comments Stephen and others have made, that thinking of renewables as, you know, an addition and supplement to the energy mix is something that these states are very used to. It's not necessarily solar or oil, but it can, you can see kind of the mix and how they can all come together and provide benefits for the state. So I think that's why support is so high in New Mexico and states like Arizona.
Thank you very much. We have a question from David Fosdick. Imagine every public building, water, wastewater plants powered by solar and storage, and those cost savings passed on to citizen ratepayers. I'm not sure if that's a question, but I think that that's part of the vision, is really helping our communities save money and be resilient. And then Mike Eisenfeld asks, who are the bill experts to support, and how can we prioritize an appropriation for this bill? Does someone want to take that, or at least part of that?
I would go ahead, Senator Pope.
I'm kind of confused on the question. Are they talking, I guess, asking for bill sponsors on that, or when they say bill experts?
Yeah, I'm a little unclear
Oh.
on that too. So the sponsors are here, Representative Sapansky and Senator Pope. We're working on the experts, and I think the other question is, how can we prioritize an appropriation for this bill? So maybe like, how can communities come out and support that or advocate for that?
Yeah, I think certainly coming to legislative hearings or participating online and giving testimony by Zoom, both are fantastic. Ultimately, a lot of the decision making about the budget is done in House Appropriations and Finance and the Senate Finance Committee. So those are two committees that you can find their membership online. And certainly, I mean, the most impactful is if you live in the district of one of the members of either of those two committees. Contacting that member is really important. But even if not, I think sharing your general support with those members is helpful. And I think it is going to take a lot of statewide support to have this rise in prioritization. So certainly doing all of that advocacy is going to be really important.
And really just talking about how this will really help your community, a bill like this. I can tell you, even before, while I was running, I had students come to me with, why isn't all the school buildings in the Albuquerque Public School District, why don't they have rooftop solar? So people are asking for a program like this. So, you know, just make the case on how this is really going to help your community and, you know, your municipality, and hopefully some of those resources and the cost savings for electrical power can be used for other services.
Thank you. John asks, I am surprised that the impact of very possible future disruptions to the grid from the climate crisis isn't brought up. I would start by saying that I think that's a huge motivating factor for this bill, you know, especially enabling communities to have solar and storage systems, really gives them and empowers them to have some resilience in the face of any disruption to the grid, to create buildings and infrastructure that don't lose power during storms and things like that. Is there anything you would add to that, Representative or Senator? Jacob asks, why 110 million fund size specifically? Why not a lower number that might be more politically attainable, or a larger number to have more money to distribute? Does one of you want to take that?
Sure, I'll jump in. So I think with the number we have, 110 million, we could definitely argue that we want to do more, right? But we also thought that was a number that would still make an impact to communities in the state. We recognize that for us to probably do what we really want to do, that number is going to have to be much larger. So this was a number we decided that we thought would make an impact. At the same time, you know, it's not going to do everything, and it's not going to fund every community and meet their needs. But I think it's still going to do a lot in our state. Because I'd also add that we're also going to be leveraging federal funding as well. So we can't forget about that.
And I would add too that the fund is structured like many funds at NMFA to be able to accept other kinds of funding. So it would be able to accept federal funding into the fund. It would be able to accept private funding, and it would be able to make investment income if the fund is invested. So it has the potential to leverage additional funding sources. We just need to kickstart it, you know, and get it going and grow it and help leverage that and get that investment into our communities. It looks like we have one more question left. And it's from John. Are you enlisting the Blue-Green Alliance in your efforts? They are a link with labor and environmentalists. And I can certainly answer this, John. So I've been very interested in Blue-Green Alliances and in how, you know, just generally, like, how do we build intersectional movements to achieve beneficial outcomes? You know, there's a lot that we can agree on. How do we get people from different sectors to work together to move things forward? And so I've actually been talking to people since last year about the possibility of forming something like a Blue-Green Alliance in New Mexico. We don't have one here, but it's something that I'm committed to working on, because I think that we really do need to find that intersectional work, particularly between labor and the environment, particularly around these questions of equitable energy transition and how we can do that in a way that supports workers and gets us to where we need to be. So we're working on it, but we don't have one in New Mexico yet. So I think it's if you're interested in getting involved in some way, it's something that's of interest to me. And there's one more question I see. When does the Roundhouse get solar panels? Does anyone know the answer to that question?
That's an excellent question. There actually is a committee that is in charge of the Capitol grounds, or sort of governs the decision making. It's called the Capitol Buildings Planning Commission. I am sure that very few of you have ever attended, because I have never actually seen a member of the public attend these meetings, even though they are open to the public. So that is a question for them, and we should ask them that.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. I just want to thank all of our panelists for your insightful presentations today. We will certainly send out the slide decks and the recording to everyone who signed up. Does anyone have any final words that you'd like to share with folks in our final minutes here? All right. Well, I'm posting a link once more in the chat to sign up to get involved. And here's some more information about the local Solar Access Fund. Thank you to all of our panelists. Thank you to all of you who attended. I hope you have a wonderful evening, and I hope we see you at the legislature. Thank you. Have a great evening.
Good night, everyone.